The Vienna Municipal Archive holds crowd density reports from 1871. I was researching infrastructure maintenance when I first noticed the figures. The Allgarten Bridge logged 2,800 visitors on an average Wednesday. St. Stephen's Cathedral, the spiritual center of the Habsburg Empire, logged 1,100. I rechecked the dates. The numbers were not holidays or festivals. They were ordinary days. The reports distinguished between Durchgang and Verweilen, passage and lingering. The bridge had more lingerers than the cathedral had worshippers. I pulled records from other months. The ratio remained constant. Bridges are not destinations. They are thresholds, or they were supposed to be. The Moscow Municipal Ledger I examined was preserved in the Russian State Archive of Ancient Acts. Fond 1287, filed under Crowd Management and Public Order. The document spanned March through November 1867. Each page contained columns for date, location, transit count, congregation count, and duration of average stay. The Bolshoi Kameny Bridge appeared on every page. The numbers were consistent. Between 2,800 and 3,400 daily visitors classified as congregation. Transit figures were separate and lower. People crossed the bridge to reach the other side, but more people came to the bridge and stayed. I pulled church attendance records from the same period. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, then still under construction but holding services in temporary quarters, logged between 700 and 1,100 daily attendees. The Church of the 12 Apostles inside the Kremlin recorded 400 to 600. St. Basil's Cathedral, the most photographed structure in Russia, averaged 500 visitors per day. The bridge exceeded all of them combined. I reminded myself that bridges serve practical functions. People might pause to watch river traffic. Street vendors might attract crowds. Weather might encourage lingering on pleasant days. I searched for explanations in the margins of the ledger. The notations were sparse but revealing. A clerk's annotation from April 1867 read, "Visitors primarily stationary near Central Arch area." Another from June noted congregation density highest at midday and early evening, not during transit hours. A third from September mentioned repeat visitors identifiable by dress and comportment, estimated at 30% of daily total. Repeat visitors, people who return to the same bridge day after day, not to cross, not to conduct business, not to meet acquaintances, to stand in specific locations at specific times. I searched for police reports. The Moscow City Police Archive contained complaints filed by merchants whose shops faced the bridge. A letter from August 1867 requested intervention regarding crowds blocking commercial traffic. The complaint specified that persons congregating on the bridge showed no interest in transit or commerce, but remained in fixed positions for periods exceeding 2 hours. 2 hours, standing on a bridge. In summer heat or autumn rain, the behavior made no sense under any interpretation I could construct. A police report from October 1867 documented an attempt to disperse a crowd of approximately 200 persons gathered near the bridge's eastern arch. The report noted that the crowd reformed within 30 minutes of dispersal. Officers described the gathering as orderly and silent. No speeches were delivered. No pamphlets were distributed. No religious observances were conducted. The people simply stood. I examined the time of day patterns more closely. Transit traffic peaked at 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., consistent with workers commuting across the river. Congregation traffic followed a different curve entirely. Numbers rose gradually from 10 a.m., peaked between 1 p.m. and 3 p.m., declined slightly, then rose again between 6 p.m. and 8 p.m., before tapering off at dusk. The pattern suggested intention. People were not wandering onto the bridge accidentally during their daily routines. They were arriving at specific times for specific durations. The midday peak coincided with the sun's highest position. The evening peak coincided with sunset. I searched for festival records, market schedules, or public events that might explain the gatherings. Nothing correlated. The crowds appeared on ordinary days, with no documented occasion. A notation from the ledger's final pages caught my attention. The clerk had written summary assessment for annual report and listed several observations. Bridge congregation exceeds church attendance by factor of 3.2 averaged across all recorded dates. Congregation demonstrates preference for specific structural locations. Duration of stay averages 94 minutes. Purpose of gathering remains undetermined. Purpose undetermined. The clerk had documented the phenomenon for 9 months without understanding what he was recording. I cross-referenced the bridge's congregation figures against other public spaces in Moscow. The Kremlin grounds, accessible to visitors during daylight hours, logged approximately 1,500 daily visitors. The Alexandrovsky Garden recorded 900. The Kitai-Gorod Market District, the commercial heart of the city, recorded 6,000 daily visitors, but nearly all were classified as transit or commerce, not congregation. The bridge was unique. People gathered there in numbers that exceeded religious observance, exceeded tourism, exceeded any category the municipal records were designed to capture. I reminded myself to remain skeptical. Records can be falsified. Clerks can exaggerate. Categories can be misapplied. I looked for internal consistency checks. The ledger included a weekly summary table reconciling daily counts with gate tax receipts from the bridge's access points. In 1867, the Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge still charged a small toll for pedestrian crossing. The reconciliation showed that congregation visitors paid the toll upon entry, but did not exit for extended periods. The financial records confirmed what the crowd counts claimed. People paid to enter the bridge and then stayed. I found a letter from the municipal tax office dated December 1867, questioning whether the bridge toll was being properly enforced. The letter noted that toll revenue exceeded projections by 40% despite no increase in commercial traffic across the river. The surplus came from persons entering but not transiting. The documentation was too consistent to dismiss as error. Multiple bureaucratic systems, crowd management, police reports, tax collection, all recorded the same phenomenon from different angles. Something was drawing crowds to this bridge in numbers that defied explanation. I searched for comparable records from other Moscow bridges. The Moskvoretsky Bridge, downstream from the Bolshoi-Kameny, showed lower congregation figures. Approximately 600 daily lingerers compared to 3,000. The Krymsky Bridge showed 400. The Bolshoi-Kameny was drawing 5 times more stationary visitors than any other crossing in the city. What distinguished this bridge from the others? I examined construction records. The Bolshoi-Kameny had been completed in 1858. Rebuilt from an earlier wooden structure, the engineering was credited to Alexander Voskresensky. The design featured sealed arch chambers beneath the roadway, chambers I had noted in earlier research for their unusual precision. I stopped myself from drawing connections. Correlation is not causation. Precise engineering does not explain crowd behavior. Sealed chambers do not attract visitors. I was looking for patterns that might not exist. But the numbers remained. Over 3,000 people daily, standing on a bridge, returning repeatedly, staying for nearly 2 hours on average. The Cathedral of Christ the Savior, which would become the largest Orthodox church in the world, could not match those figures. Bridges do not inspire devotion. They are infrastructure, functional, utilitarian. People cross them because they need to reach the other side. They do not make pilgrimages to stand upon them in silent congregation. Yet the record said otherwise. The Moscow Municipal Archive documented a phenomenon that should not exist. I filed my notes and prepared to search for similar records elsewhere. If this was an anomaly, it would appear nowhere else. If it was a pattern, other cities would show the same. The language changed in the later ledgers. I found the shift in records from 1871, 4 years after the initial documentation I had examined. A new clerk had taken over the crowd management reports, and his terminology differed from his predecessors. Where the earlier records used congregation, the 1871 documents introduced a phrase I had not encountered in any municipal archive before: restorative visitation. The term appeared without explanation or definition. A notation from May 1871 recorded 2,940 restorative visitors to the Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge. Another from July listed 3,100 restorative visitors with average duration of 87 minutes. The category had replaced congregation entirely. The clerk was not describing people who gathered. He was describing people who came for restoration. I searched for context. A marginal note in the August 1871 ledger referenced a directive from the Moscow Municipal Health Office regarding documentation of atmospheric therapeutic sites. The note was brief. Henceforth, classify bridge visitors under restorative category per Health Office Memorandum 34-1871. The Health Office had issued a memorandum. The bridge had been classified as an atmospheric therapeutic site. The crowds were not anomalies to be managed. They were patients seeking treatment. I requested access to Health Office records from the 1870s. The archivist informed me that most memoranda from that period had been lost or transferred to military archives during the Soviet reorganization of 1920. Memorandum 34-1871 was not in the accessible collection. Only its reference in the crowd management ledger proved it had existed. But the language remained. Restorative visitation, atmospheric therapeutic. The municipal bureaucracy had developed categories for something that should not require categorization. People visiting bridges for their health. I noted the observation and expanded my search beyond Moscow. The pattern repeated in Paris. I found it in the Archives Nationales, Series F14, Infrastructure and Public Works. Visitor ledgers from the Pont Neuf, spanning 1865 to 1878, showed the same phenomenon I had documented in Moscow. Daily congregation figures exceeding 4,000. Average duration of stay recorded at 78 minutes. Repeat visitors estimated at 25 to 35% of daily totals. The Parisian records use different terminology. Fréquentation stationnaire, stationary frequentation. But the numbers matched Moscow's ratios with unsettling precision. I calculated the visitor-to-bridge length ratio for both structures. The Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge measured 170 meters. At 3,200 daily congregation visitors, the ratio was 18.8 visitors per meter. The Pont Neuf measured 232 meters. At 4,300 daily stationary visitors, the ratio was 18.5 visitors per meter. The ratios were nearly identical. Two bridges in different cities, different empires, different climates, different cultures, drawing crowds at the same proportional density. I reminded myself that coincidence was possible. Large bridges in major cities might naturally attract similar crowd behaviors. Tourism, commerce, and social gathering could produce comparable patterns without implying coordination or shared function. I searched for explanations in the Parisian records. A police report from 1869 described efforts to manage pedestrian flow on the Pont Neuf. The report noted that visitors showed marked preference for positions near the bridge's central spans and that attempts to encourage movement were met with passive resistance. People who had come to stand did not wish to walk. A newspaper article from Le Figaro, dated June 1867, described the Pont Neuf as the most fashionable promenade in Paris. The article noted that persons of quality could be observed taking their constitutional upon the bridge at midday, remaining for periods of 1 to 2 hours before departing. The practice was described as beneficial to the constitution and restorative to the spirits. Restorative. The same word had appeared in Moscow 4 years later. The Parisian newspaper used it casually, as if the concept required no explanation. Bridges were restorative. Everyone knew this. The article did not say why. I searched for photographs. The Bibliothèque Nationale de France holds an extensive collection of early Parisian photography. I requested images of the Pont Neuf from the 1860s and 1870s. The photographs showed what the records described. Crowds of people standing on the bridge, not walking, not crossing. Standing in clusters near specific architectural features, the central arch, the carved alcoves, the positions where the bridge's substructure created recessed spaces above the water. One photograph from 1872 showed approximately 60 people visible on a single span. Perhaps 10 were clearly in motion, walking toward the camera or away from it. The remaining 50 stood in small groups or alone, facing the water or facing inward toward the bridge's stonework. Several appeared to have their eyes closed. I examined the photograph's background. The streets leading to the bridge showed normal pedestrian traffic. People walked with purpose toward destinations. On the bridge itself, movement stopped. The structure was not a thoroughfare. It was a destination. A second photograph from 1874 showed a similar scene from a different angle. This image captured the bridge's eastern approach. A queue of people waited to enter. Not a queue for commerce or transit. A queue to access the bridge itself, as if admission were limited or regulated. I found no record of admission restrictions in the 1870s. The queue suggested demand exceeding capacity. More people wanted to stand on the Pont Neuf than could comfortably fit. Church attendance records from the same period told a different story. Notre Dame Cathedral logged between 1,100 and 1,400 daily visitors during the late 1860s. Saint-Sulpice recorded 600 to 800. The Madeleine averaged 500. Combined, the three largest churches in Paris drew approximately 2,500 daily visitors. The Pont Neuf alone exceeded that figure by 70%. I calculated comparative ratios. Parisians visited the Pont Neuf at 1.7 times and the rate they visited their three largest churches combined. Muscovites visited the Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge at 3.2 times the rate they visited their largest cathedral. The patterns varied in magnitude, but pointed in the same direction. Bridges drew crowds that religious architecture could not match. The photographs troubled me more than the statistics. Numbers can be manipulated. Categories can be misapplied. But photographs show what existed. And these photographs showed people standing on bridges in postures that resembled prayer or meditation, eyes closed, faces tilted upward, hands resting on stonework, bodies positioned in recessed spaces as if seeking something the open air did not provide. I filed the Parisian records alongside the Moscow documentation. 2 cities, 2 empires, 2 sets of records describing the same phenomenon with the same proportional consistency. People gathering on bridges in numbers that exceeded religious attendance, staying for durations that exceeded any practical purpose, returning repeatedly as if the bridges offered something no other structure could provide. The pattern was forming. I needed more cities to confirm it. Vienna confirmed the pattern. The Österreichisches Staatsarchiv holds municipal records from the Habsburg administration. And I found visitor documentation for the Augarten Bridge spanning 1868 to 1879. The terminology differed again. German bureaucrats used Verweilbesucher, lingering visitors, but the numbers followed the same ratios I had documented in Moscow and Paris. The Augarten Bridge measured 145 meters. Daily lingering visitors averaged 2,750. The ratio calculated to 19.0 visitors per meter, within statistical margin of the Moscow and Parisian figures. 3 bridges in 3 empires showing identical crowd density patterns. A Vienna police report from 1873 described the bridge gatherings in clinical detail. Visitors arrived predominantly between 11 and 14 hours, the report noted. They positioned themselves at regular intervals along the bridge span, showing preference for locations above the central piers. Duration of stay ranges from 45 minutes to 3 hours. Behavior is passive. No commerce, no assembly, no apparent social interaction. Visitors stand or sit in apparent contemplation. Apparent contemplation. The police officer had observed something he could not categorize. People came to the bridge to think, or to feel, or to receive something the report could not name. I found sketch evidence in the Albertina Museum's collection of 19th century Viennese street scenes. An 1871 drawing by an unknown artist depicted the Augarten Bridge at midday. The sketch showed approximately 40 figures on the visible span. Most stood alone, spaced at regular intervals like markers on a measuring tape. A few sat on the bridge's stone railings. None appeared to be in conversation. None appeared to be in transit. The artist had titled the sketch Die Brückenandacht, the bridge devotion. The word andacht carried religious connotation. Devotion, meditation, worship. The artist saw what the police report described and named it something sacred. Budapest showed the same phenomenon at larger scale. The Széchenyi Chain Bridge, completed in 1849, generated visitor records that exceeded even the Pont Neuf. I found the documentation in the Budapest City Archives. Fond 7, Public Spaces and Monuments. The chain bridge measured 375 meters, the longest of the structures I had examined. Daily congregation figures from the 1870s averaged 7,100 visitors. The ratio calculated to 18.9 visitors per meter. Identical to Vienna. Identical to Moscow. Identical to Paris. A Hungarian newspaper article from 1872 described the chain bridge as the healthful promenade of the nation. The article encouraged readers to take their daily constitutional upon the bridge, preferably at midday, when the atmospheric benefits were strongest. Atmospheric benefits. The phrase appeared without elaboration, as if readers understood what it meant. I searched for medical documentation. The Semmelweis Medical History Museum in Budapest holds journals from the Hungarian Medical Society. A brief article from 1869 mentioned bridge visitation in a discussion of urban therapeutic resources. The author, a physician named István Kovács, wrote that certain bridges appear to concentrate atmospheric properties beneficial to respiratory and nervous complaints. He recommended bridge visitation as a complement to traditional treatment. The article cited no research. It offered no mechanism. It simply stated that bridges were therapeutic and moved on to other topics. The claim was presented as established fact, not hypothesis. I found similar fragments in Austrian and French medical literature. A Viennese journal from 1871 mentioned bridge air in a discussion of urban health. A Parisian publication from 1868 referenced the restorative qualities of certain elevated structures spanning moving water. The references were brief, almost parenthetical. No journal devoted sustained attention to the phenomenon, but multiple journals acknowledged it in passing, as if bridge therapeutics were common knowledge unworthy of detailed examination. St. Petersburg added another data point. The Trinity Bridge, though not completed until 1903, replaced an earlier pontoon structure that had served since 1803. Visitor records from the pontoon bridge showed the same patterns. I found them in the Russian State Historical Archive. Fond 1,293 municipal services. Daily congregation on the Trinity Pontoon Bridge averaged 2,400 visitors in the 1870s. The structure measured 130 meters. The ratio calculated to 18.5 visitors per meter. The pattern held across 5 cities, 5 bridges, 5 separate imperial administrations. I overlaid the bridge locations on 18th century maps showing Tartarian territorial designations. The cartographic sources varied. French maps labeled the regions Grande Tartarie. German maps used Grosse Tartarie. English maps showed Great Tartary. The boundaries shifted between cartographers, but all 5 cities fell within regions that had carried the Tartarian designation before 1830. Moscow sat at the western edge of what maps called Muscovite Tartary. Vienna and Budapest fell within territories some cartographers labeled as formerly Tartarian or historically Tartary. Paris was an outlier, lying west of any Tartarian designation. But the Pont Neuf had been built on foundations dating to 1578, predating most reliable cartographic records. I noted the correlation without drawing conclusions. Maps do not determine architecture. Geographic labels do not explain crowd behavior. But the bridges showing identical visitor ratios all fell within or near territories that had once carried a name now erased from modern cartography. The pattern shifted in the 1870s. I found the change first in Vienna. A municipal order dated March 1874 restricted access to the Augarten Bridge between the hours of 10 a.m. and 4 p.m. The order cited concerns about pedestrian congestion interfering with commercial transit. Visitors wishing to access the bridge during restricted hours required permits issued by the Municipal Health Office. The Health Office, not the police, not the Transit Authority. The Health Office controlled access to a bridge. I searched for similar orders in other cities. Budapest issued bridge access regulations in 1876. The chain bridge would be closed to non-transit visitors during peak atmospheric hours except by medical authorization. Peak atmospheric hours. The phrase appeared in an official government document without definition or explanation. Paris followed in 1878. A prefecture order limited stationary occupation of the Pont Neuf to 30 minutes maximum during daylight hours. The order was justified as a public safety measure. Crowds were blocking emergency access. Moscow's restrictions came earliest. I found them in police records from 1872. The Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge was designated a transit priority structure. Loitering was prohibited. Persons remaining stationary for more than 15 minutes were subject to dispersal. The restrictions appeared across 4 cities within a 6-year window, 1872 to 1878. Different governments, different languages, different legal systems, all implementing similar controls on bridge access during the same narrow period. I cross-referenced the restriction dates against renovation records I had compiled in earlier research. The Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge underwent chamber ceiling renovations in 1874, 2 years after access restrictions began. The Allgarten Bridge sealed its subarch voids in 1876, 2 years after its restrictions. The Pont Neuf filled its internal chambers in 1879, 1 year after its access limitations. The pattern was precise. Restrictions preceded renovations. Access was limited before chambers were sealed. The crowds were dispersed before the infrastructure was modified. I could not determine causation from the records. Perhaps the renovations required crowd control for safety. Perhaps the restrictions were unrelated to the construction work. But the timing suggested coordination. Something was being closed, first to people, then permanently. The language in the renovation records revealed what the restriction orders had obscured. I found it in a Vienna Municipal Works report from 1876, filed alongside the chamber ceiling documentation for the Allgarten Bridge. The report justified the renovation expenditure with a phrase I had not encountered in any prior infrastructure document: closure of obsolete therapeutic infrastructure no longer in active function. Obsolete therapeutic infrastructure. The bridge had contained systems designed for therapeutic purpose. Those systems were now obsolete. The renovation was not maintenance. It was decommissioning. I searched for similar language in other cities. The Budapest chain bridge renovation records from 1877 mentioned elimination of atmospheric regulation apparatus rendered non-functional by structural modifications. The Parisian archives used different terminology, but the same concept. A Pont Neuf engineering assessment from 1879 recommended permanent sealing of internal voids previously associated with environmental therapeutic effects. The bureaucrats knew, the engineers knew. The municipal authorities across 4 empires understood that these bridges had served therapeutic functions. The records did not explain how. They did not describe mechanisms. They simply acknowledged that something therapeutic had existed and no longer worked. I returned to the medical literature. The brief references I had found in journals from the 1860s and early 1870s vanished from publications after 1880. I searched indices from the Viennese Medical Weekly, the Paris Medical Gazette, the Hungarian Medical Society Proceedings, and the Russian Imperial Medical Journal. Bridge therapeutics appeared as a topic in scattered articles between 1865 and 1878. After 1880, nothing. The silence was total. A phenomenon acknowledged by multiple medical publications across multiple countries disappeared from professional literature within a 2-year window. Physicians who had recommended bridge visitation for respiratory and nervous complaints stopped mentioning the practice. The therapeutic category that municipal health offices had used to classify visitors vanished from administrative records. I found one exception. A letter to the editor of the British medical journal The Lancet, published in March 1882, asked why continental physicians had abandoned bridge therapeutics as a treatment modality. The author, a doctor, William Hartley of Manchester, noted that he had observed beneficial effects from bridge visitation during travels in Vienna and Budapest in the 1870s. He wondered why the practice had fallen out of favor. The letter received no published response. No explanation appeared in subsequent issues. The question hung unanswered in the archive. A single voice asking what had happened to a treatment that had once drawn thousands. I remembered the 1863 Engineering Journal article I had encountered in earlier research. The piece in the Civil Engineer and Architects Journal had speculated about secondary functions of bridge architecture. The author had described hypothetical features, including sealed chambers for pressure equalization and symmetrically placed voids for atmospheric regulation. The article had seemed theoretical when I first read it. Now the language matched the renovation records precisely. Pressure equalization, atmospheric regulation. The 1863 author had described exactly what the 1870s bureaucrats were decommissioning. I reread the article with new attention. The author suggested that bridges could function as environmental regulators, affecting not just water flow, but atmospheric conditions in their vicinity. He proposed that sealed chambers beneath bridge decks might create pressure differentials with therapeutic properties for persons standing above. The hypothesis was speculative. The author cited no evidence, named no bridges, identified no mechanisms. But the speculation matched the physical evidence I had documented. Sealed chambers existed. Therapeutic effects were recorded. Crowds gathered in numbers that exceeded religious attendance. And then, within a narrow historical window, the chambers were filled, the effects ceased, and the crowds dispersed. The 1863 article vanished from engineering literature as completely as bridge therapeutics vanished from medical journals. I searched for follow-up publications, citations, or responses. Nothing appeared. The idea was introduced and then abandoned, as if the topic had become inappropriate for professional discussion. I formulated a hypothesis. The bridges had functioned as therapeutic infrastructure, drawing crowds because the sealed chambers beneath their decks produced atmospheric effects beneficial to human health. The crowds were not anomalies. They were patients accessing treatment. The visitor ratios were consistent across cities because the therapeutic effect scaled with bridge length. The restrictions began when authorities decided to end public access to the treatment. The renovations sealed the chambers permanently, eliminating the effect and dispersing the crowds. The hypothesis explained the evidence. It did not explain why. Why would multiple governments coordinate to eliminate therapeutic infrastructure? Why would the medical profession abandon a treatment modality that drew thousands of willing participants? Why would engineers seal chambers that provided measurable public benefit? I searched for answers in political records. The 1870s marked a period of rapid industrialization across Europe. Railways expanded. Factories multiplied. Urban populations grew. Municipal authorities faced pressure to move people efficiently through cities. Bridges were transit infrastructure. Their therapeutic function impeded their transportation function. The explanation was plausible but incomplete. It did not account for the systematic erasure from professional literature. It did not explain why health offices controlled bridge access rather than transit authorities. It did not address why the same actions occurred simultaneously across empires that were political rivals with no documented coordination on infrastructure policy. I found fragments suggesting deeper patterns. A Russian imperial memorandum from 1873, partially preserved in military archives, referenced coordination with European counterparts on matters of atmospheric infrastructure management. The memorandum was heavily redacted. Entire paragraphs had been removed. But the surviving text acknowledged that the Russian Empire was acting in concert with other powers on policies related to public access to certain structures. Atmospheric infrastructure. The phrase appeared in an imperial military document discussing coordination with foreign governments. The bridges were not local municipal concerns. They were matters of international policy. I could not determine who coordinated the actions or why. The records documented what happened without explaining the reasoning. Chambers were sealed. Crowds were dispersed. Literature was silenced. The therapeutic function of bridges was erased from public knowledge within a single decade. The Tartarian hypothesis offered one explanation. If the bridges were inherited infrastructure from a prior civilization, the 19th century governments may have decommissioned systems they did not fully understand. The therapeutic effects were real, but the mechanisms were unknown. Rather than maintain technology they could not replicate, authorities chose to eliminate it entirely. The alternative hypothesis was coordinated suppression. Multiple governments recognized that bridge therapeutics represented a public health resource outside their control. People could access treatment without physicians, without payment, without permission. The crowds at bridges represented autonomous healing that bypassed institutional medicine and state authority. Eliminating the function restored control. I could not prove either interpretation. I could only demonstrate that something existed, something worked, something drew crowds in numbers that exceeded religious devotion, and then something was deliberately ended. I returned to the Moscow records where my investigation had begun. The Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge ledgers from 1867 now read differently. The 3,200 daily visitors were not curiosities. They were patients. The 94-minute average duration was not loitering. It was treatment. The photograph I returned to was dated 1894. It showed a sealed stone aperture beneath the Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge, captured just before workers filled the cavity with hydraulic cement. I had examined this image months earlier when researching construction anomalies. Now I saw what I had missed. The stonework surrounding the aperture bore marks. Shallow scratches in the granite surface, precisely spaced, each approximately 3 centimeters apart. The marks extended in parallel lines from the aperture opening toward the bridge deck above. They were not tool marks from construction. They were not damage from weathering. They were calibration marks, measurement indicators etched into stone. I magnified the photograph until the grain distorted. The scratches aligned with positions on the bridge deck, where crowd photographs had shown the densest concentration of visitors. The marks pointed upward toward the exact locations where people had gathered in the 1860s and 1870s. The aperture had not been decorative. It had not been structural. It had been measuring something, monitoring something, and the measurements correlated with where people chose to stand. I searched for similar marks in photographs of other bridges. The Pont Neuf images from the 1870s showed comparable scratches near sealed chambers. The Vienna photographs were too low in resolution to confirm, but the Budapest chain bridge showed faint parallel lines in a construction photograph from 1849. The marks predated the official completion of the bridge by several months. Someone had calibrated these structures before they opened to the public. Someone had measured the relationship between the sealed chambers and the positions above them. The crowds who gathered in the 1860s and 1870s were standing in locations that had been marked decades earlier. I examined modern photographs of the same bridges. The Bolshoi-Kameny still spans the Moskva River. The Pont Neuf still crosses the Seine. The chain bridge still connects Buda and Pest. Tourists photograph them. Commuters cross them. Traffic flows in patterns optimized for transit efficiency. No one lingers. The photographs show empty spans between pedestrians in motion. No clusters form near the central arches. No queues wait for access. The bridges function as infrastructure, nothing more. I visited the Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge in person during a research trip in early 2024. I stood at the center span where crowd photographs had shown the densest gathering in 1867. I remained for 30 minutes, observing the space and my own responses to it. The bridge felt ordinary. Stone beneath my feet, traffic noise from vehicles, wind off the river. No sensation of restoration, no therapeutic effect I could perceive. The sealed chambers lay somewhere beneath me, filled with cement, their function eliminated over a century ago. I watched other pedestrians cross. None paused. None positioned themselves at the locations marked in historical photographs. The bridge moved people from one bank to the other with maximum efficiency. Its secondary function, if it had ever existed, was gone. The Tartarian hypothesis suggests these bridges were components of a civilization's infrastructure network, designed to provide therapeutic benefit to populations across vast territories. The sealed chambers regulated atmospheric or energetic conditions. The crowds who gathered were accessing a public health resource built into the urban fabric. When the Tartarian territories were absorbed into modern nation-states, the new authorities decommissioned systems they could not understand or control. The hypothesis explains the evidence. It explains the identical visitor ratios across cities that shared no documented engineering coordination. It explains the therapeutic language in municipal records. It explains the systematic sealing of chambers and dispersal of crowds during the same narrow historical window. It explains why bridges drew more visitors than churches in an era when religious observance remained central to social life. I could not prove the hypothesis. The records that might confirm it were missing, redacted, or never created. The physical evidence had been sealed beneath cement. The crowds who experienced the therapeutic effects left no first-hand accounts that survived. The alternative explanations were less satisfying. Mass delusion across multiple cities and cultures seemed implausible given the consistency of the phenomenon. Fashion or social trend did not account for the precise visitor ratios or the therapeutic language in official documents. Coincidental crowd behavior did not explain why medical journals acknowledged bridge therapeutics and then stopped acknowledging them within a 2-year period. Something real had drawn those crowds. Something measurable had produced the visitor ratios. Something functional had justified the term therapeutic infrastructure in government renovation records. The something was now gone, and we have no vocabulary to describe what we lost. I returned to the 1867 Moscow ledger one final time. The clerk, who documented congregation figures for 9 months, had written a phrase in his annual summary that I had overlooked in my initial research. A marginal notation, squeezed into the corner of the final page, read personal observation. Visitors report sensation of well-being and clarity upon the bridge that does not persist after departure. Effect is consistent across individuals, mechanism unknown. The clerk had asked the visitors why they came. They told him they felt better on the bridge. They told him the feeling stopped when they left. They returned because the bridge gave them something they could not find elsewhere. The churches offered salvation. The bridges offered something immediate, tangible, reproducible. Thousands chose the bridges. I closed the archive folder. The investigation had accumulated evidence without reaching conclusion. Something existed. Something worked. Something was deliberately ended. The records documented the phenomenon and the erasure, but not the reasoning. The reasoning died with the administrators who authorized the sealing orders and the engineers who supervised the cement pours. The bridges still stand. Moscow, Paris, Vienna, Budapest, St. Petersburg. Stone and iron spanning water, carrying traffic, performing the function that history says they were always meant to perform. Transit infrastructure? Nothing more. But the measurement marks remain visible in old photographs. The sealed apertures exist beneath layers of cement. The crowd records sit in archives, documenting gatherings that should not have occurred if bridges were only built to cross. I do not know what the chambers contained. I do not know how they produce therapeutic effects. I do not know why multiple governments coordinated to eliminate a public health resource that drew more visitors than any church. I know only that bridges once served a purpose we no longer remember. People gathered on them in devotion to something that was not religion. They came in numbers that exceeded worship. They stayed for durations that exceeded transit. And then they stopped, because there was nothing left to feel. The Bolshoi-Kameny Bridge still stands. Traffic crosses daily. Tourists photograph the Kremlin from its spans. No one lingers at the center arch. No one closes their eyes and tilts their face upward. No one returns day after day seeking restoration. There is nothing left to return for.